Hey, Living Streams. I'm sitting here with my friend Dalton Davis.
Hello.
And Dalton normally is behind the scenes, but here he is in front of the scenes, I guess. I don't know.
In front of the camera.
Yeah, in front of the camera. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
And we are doing this podcast because we're in a series called our Credo series, and just Latin for I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about the major tenets of the faith, the major things that we believe in.
Right.
And because of that, we figured just a supplemental podcast between these things, because here's my notes from Sunday morning. I talked about probably like 30% of this.
Yep.
And then in the back of my brain, I've got like 80% more of this. I don't know how that works out.
That's like a common thing.
Yes.
I feel like with you specifically.
Yes, there's a lot. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of things and heard a lot of things. So there's kind of a lot that goes into these, especially this series.
Mm-hmm.
And this last week, talking about the discernment of truth, it's such a big topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I touched on a few things, but we thought, hey, let's do a podcast. And I promised everybody on Sunday, which committed us to it, let's do a little longer form podcast to really let some of these ideas breathe.
Right.
So Dalton's here to hang out and sip bubbly water and ask me questions and all of that.
Yeah.
So here we are. This is it. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of diving into like what you were preaching on yesterday.
Yeah.
Kind of this idea of like discerning truth, right? So right before the camera started, something like piqued my interest, which was like this idea that we kind of all, even if you don't worship like God, like we do, or Jesus, we all kind of subscribe to a belief system. So in discerning truth, like what do you think is like in finding truth, which is that like does she touch on that topic at all about
for sure.
About, like, even if you're not explicitly like, oh, I worship whatever alternative God, you know, from Jesus, which we worship, like what people subscribe to as far as their ideologies and stuff like that.
I think that, like this book Dalton was talking about, we've been reading this as a teaching team. Nancy Pearcey's excellent. And this is 5 principles for unmasking atheism, secularism, and other God substitutes, which I love that last one. And she talks about how ultimately, when you're pursuing truth, and I've seen this a lot in my life, when you pursue truth, you inevitably end up at the doorstep of Jesus. Right. You just have to. And Jesus even says about himself, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So there's something about truth that is a part of who he is. And I've seen a lot of people in my life that as they are pursuing something that is true, eventually they find themselves in a place where they're pursuing Jesus. And there's an old phrase from church fathers, I don't even know who said it. Like it's been one of those things that's been said a lot, but all truth is God's truth. And that's not a kind of open theism sort of, whatever you believe is fine. No, that's not a universalist sort of thing. What it means is that if something is true, and it's in the absolute truest sense of the word true, that is something that belongs to God. God creates truth. There's something about him and Jesus in particular that he embodies truth, which is so weird for us. We have such an ethereal view of truth, and especially in sort of postmodern thought, which we'll talk about. We're almost uncomfortable with truth. Like, oh, can there be something true?
Right.
And Jesus is going, no, in your pursuit of me and in your pursuit of truth, you will find yourself at my doorstep. And I think when you're trying to discern whether something is true, the pursuit of truth is actually a pretty holy endeavor, whether we know it or not, you know? Right. And there are people that in their pursuit of truth find themselves in a place where they find Jesus, they start learning more about it, and they go, this actually makes sense.
Working out our own faiths.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And so this is a popular pop culture figure right now, but Jordan Peterson is one of those guys that you see him as like he's a college professor, but he is a guy that wants to figure out, is something true or not? You know, you just see him going, well, is that true? Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense. And you see kind of him starting to teach the Bible, though he's not a Christian. He's teaching the Bible, and he's going, this is actually very interesting. And he dives deep into all these different things in the Bible.
He even goes in to say like that he actually recommends it as like a book of like morality, like general morality. Like even if you don't believe in God or Jesus, you should probably just follow like God is like kind of a good guy. Even in the Old Testament, he has like very, very in-depth teachings that are on YouTube actually for free if you want to. He goes through Genesis and
like
unpacks
2.5 hours.
Yeah, it's very dense. I've tried to watch it. It's very hard to get through.
It's incredibly dense. Yeah. But he's a guy that I would really say, like at his core, he's trying to not be, as much as he can, like he's trying to say objectively, is this true or not true? Right. Which brings him into some pretty controversial areas these days.
Yes.
But I recently watched an interview where he was talking about Jesus, and he started to tear up. And you just see, and not saying, oh, he's a Christian icon, anything like that. He is a guy that I think represents this sort of, as you pursue truth, you eventually find yourself at Jesus' doorstep, and you go, I have to decide about this. This is, and as Christians, sometimes I think we forget about that. I think sometimes it's like, oh, we kind of take for granted, oh yeah, Jesus said some really great stuff. And it's so much more than that, you know. Even this last Sunday, I was talking about how when you read the words of Jesus, there's like something new that you pick up every time. And I've been following Jesus for 20-something years now, and I've been reading the Bible pretty much every day since I became a Christian. Right. And there are certain stories in the Bible that I'm like, I have read this 36 times. Yeah. But it still sticks out as like, oh, there's something new. It's like kind of living an active Word of God kind of thing. And I think we take that for granted. You don't get that with War and Peace. You don't get that. Like, you might get some new information from it, but you're not going to read War and Peace every day the rest of your life and go, oh, you know, let me plumb the depths of this thing. Right. And so I think in a lot of ways, in our pursuit of truth, as Christians, we kind of take truth for granted. I don't know how else to say it. We kind of go, oh yeah, well, it's there, and the words of Jesus are always there.
It stales for sure.
Yes, yeah. And so I think in this series, and as we've been leaning into this a lot more, understanding what is true and what isn't true in our culture, especially right now, is really important. It's really important. And we're hearing messages fly at us left and right, and things are changing on a dime. We were talking about AI before we hit record on this. Like, there are so many, like there are things that are happening in the news every week that if I was a kid and it happened, it would like take over the news for months. Right. And now we're kind of like, oh, another earth-shattering thing happened. Yep, AI is happening again.
Yeah,
you know?
China's behind yet another social media app.
Yes, exactly. China's doing more stuff.
Whatever.
And this Russia thing, and you know, like, and there's so it's kind of shock and awe in a lot of ways. And so as Christians, what do we have to say to that? And I think as I was coming up with this sermon, one of the things that I was pushing back against is there's this sort of popular idea in Christian circles right now, and especially with church leaders, and I'm in circles with church leaders, and they're like, and I've said phrases like this, and I'm just rethinking them a little bit, but like, well, we got to just rise above what's going on in the world, and we just got to just talk about Jesus, and we don't have to like dive into all this stuff. And the more I thought about it, especially in the last week, and I wrote it down, and that was one of those points in the sermon. I'm like, I'm so sorry, I'm going to offend some of you right now, but there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I'm just not paying attention to the news because it's just so discouraging.
That's me, honestly. That literally, like we've talked about that a lot.
So
like,
totally.
Well, even with David Stockton, like I remember catching up with him in the hallway. It's like so hard. I was telling him it's so hard to be apolitical right now. And that was like the height of like, you know, 2020 and stuff like that.
And politics, I mean, from 2019 till now, politics is just a totally random, crazy, totally different area, you know? And there's 1,000 reasons that's happened. But I think when you look at the world, it's really easy to go, gosh, I don't want to know because it's just a lot easier for me, you know, to keep going. Part of me thinks, you know, there is that side. Okay, if you're paying attention to the news and you're like, I'm not reading my Bible anymore. I'm like, I can talk to my family and friends about nothing but politics. If some of you are out there doing that. If you're like, I'm not sleeping. I'm not, you know, these are troubling signs like, hey, stop paying attention. But the challenge on the other side is, are you not paying attention because it's poking at an idol in your life? And I got to say that on Sunday, but I didn't get to unpack it. Because to me, I go, so you look at the financial situation in the world right now. This is a scary stat. 40% of all dollars that are in circulation right now in the world were printed since 2020. That's a massive amount of money. And they're just cranking out money, you know. and inflation is going up, and we're going, okay, but pretty soon it's going to calm down, right? And I think anybody who pays attention to that stuff goes, oh, I don't think so. Like this is going to be something we're going to pay for. Like you can't just print money and expect, And so there are people that hear that, and what they think about is their 401k, or they think about that savings account that they've been putting money away every day, every paycheck. They've been putting money in there, trusting the system, trusting the world, going, it's going to be fine. I'm going to get X amount of percentage return on that guarantee, Yeah. When you hear news like that, does that make you go, ooh, that scares me, because I am trusting in this money that's in the account. Right. And if it doesn't show up there one day, or if inflation is so bad, it's actually not going to take care of me in retirement. These are things that Jesus never promised us were going to be there. This is not God-given promises. Right. This is Bank of America promises, or this is, whatever. Yeah. And as Christians, we should innately know that. Like there should be something in us innately that's a little suspect of anything that the world is giving us. And so when you hear that news and it pricks your heart, instead of saying, I'm going to not pay attention because it really bums me out, sometimes it's good to ask the question, why is it bumming me out? Shouldn't I be freed from that? Shouldn't there be part of me that's not touched by that because I follow Jesus, and it's a different system. It's a different world. It's a different kingdom. And the challenge for people when they're saying, oh, I don't want to pay attention, is really pay attention to your heart. Right. So, yeah.
Where do you think that's born out of, though? Like that kind of like this idea of like, I put a lot of trust in like systems and government systems and stuff like that, and I'm kind of distracted. Like if you could, like, is there a common thread that you've noticed, or like where does that usually start?
I think it's the classic idol of America is comfort. Yeah. And reliability on a system that's been in place for really historically not too long. Right. But for us, we don't know anything different. Right. So this idolatry of comfort tells us, or maybe it's a little bit of manifest destiny or whatever it is, these things that seep into us, and we go, as Americans, this couldn't happen, and there's no way. I have a little note in here. It says the understanding the times, the early warning system, and I never said this, but I have the come on attitude. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
There is a prevailing thought in America when somebody says, oh, the financial system might collapse, or China and Russia might band together and we might have World War III with a nuclear power. What does that look like? There are a lot of Americans that, and I think some of it's self-protection, like they don't want to think about it because it's a little too scary. Right. But they come across as, come on. That wouldn't happen. And there's no way, Yeah. What is that attitude based on? Well, that attitude is based on the last few generations.
I was about to ask.
We've had comfort. The money, we put money in the account and it's always there. Well, we have 3 or 4% inflation. Yeah. That's what life
especially
is.
In like a modernist society like the 60s, where like the getting was so good, right? Yes. Like the dollar was killing it, and like everyone had TVs, and it was it was like that nuclear family, which like, not to disparage the idea of that, right? But like kind of what we think about, the 2 kids, married.
2.5 kids,
yeah,
mom and dad.
Exactly. So do you think like, what do you see in comparison of like so we've talked like we're millennials on the probably the most like opposite ends of the spectrum.
Sure. Yeah.
So, like,
got a weird generation.
Yeah,
Millennials
exactly.
A weird generation.
Yeah, it is. No, for sure. So, like, what do you think? There's anything good? I guess two parts to my question. Sure. Sorry. One, do you think we've learned a lot of that from our forefathers and generations before, baby boomers, post World War II era? And then also in comparison to that, do you think there's anything to take away that's positive from maybe a later millennial to Gen Z kind of era?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yes, we picked some of this up from our forefathers for sure. Like you look at the greatest generation, they faced World War, they faced financial collapse of 1929 and all that, and really, the crash of 29 was the beginning of 10 years of pain. Like it's like you look at the 2020 when we have this major event that happens. Right. We think, in a couple of years it'll be done, but history tells us it's actually the beginning of probably a decade of we're going to feel this. And so of course I think they went through something hard. They fought for freedom in a lot of ways, or they saw, World War II, and they fought for, we could see dictatorship, we could see the emergence of communism, some of these things that were new. They fought it back, and they were like, we kept this thing. And there was a rebirth a little bit in the society. And societies go through these cycles all the time. So this sort of rebirth of society happens at that point. And before then, we had Civil War. There's all sorts of things that added up to that moment of this rebirth of people going, I do appreciate America. I do appreciate freedom. I'm thankful for this place. Then it moves into kind of baby boomer generation, which is kind of the counter reaction to that, And this is the emergence of postmodern thought. I mean, it's been coming for a while. There's probably a couple of decades that's leading into the 1960s that postmodernism is coming around. Right. But what we don't really fully appreciate is between the 1950s and 1960s, there's a change that happens in society that hadn't happened since 1500. That's a long time. Right. We're talking this 400 and something year cycle that when we hit modernism, the very beginning of it is the Reformation. Right. This whole we're taking the Bible back, which we think is like, what's that? Yeah. What a big deal, but no big deal. No, it's a huge deal. Right. Like pulling it out of the hands of just a handful of people and going, everybody can read the Bible. Yeah. It's this really big counter reaction that people started to feel like, can humans have that much freedom? Right. Which of course is coming from the people in power mostly. Right. And we went through a whole new rebirth that led us into art, and it led us into, architecture and art. All that we study is right in the backside of the Reformation. And this age of enlightenment and all of the things that are going on in science and art and culture is coming together. And you would really look at it as like the 40s and 50s. It's like the modern man, like mankind can go to the moon. Mankind could build that. Like we could build the tallest skyscraper in the world. We're not held bound by anything, And it's a beautiful mindset in so many ways, It's created this sort of like, mankind took so much ground in that time between 1500 to 1960s. Right. It's like, wow. But then in the 1960s, this major shift happens. And people are going, well, yeah, mankind can do that. But there's this sort of snarky sort of like, but yeah, they're also taking us to war. And yeah, they're also doing this. And then Vietnam's going on. And this counter reaction that happens in kind of a comfortable generation that was sitting after the greatest generation. And it really tips us into postmodernism. And postmodernism is saying, okay, well, yeah, mankind could do anything, but who cares? What we really need is just to be free-spirited and you do your thing. Like, I'm not going to try to impose anything on you. And so this sort of sensitivity in culture that hadn't really existed starts to emerge, that we are like saturated in. Like it's hard for us, like my son, Toby, will be like, oh, that's cringy. And I'm like, that is directly a postmodern thought that's leaking into you right now. Like this whole idea of I don't want to make you uncomfortable and I don't like that just, in the age of enlightenment, that was everything was talking with people who didn't agree with you and go, let's find some common ground. And so what happened in postmodernism is we started to break people out into groups and we go, oh, you belong to that group. So that's how you think. You're a Republican, so that's how you think. And you're a Democrat, so that's how you think. And it even leaks into race and gender. You're a woman, so this is what you should believe. And you're black, and this is what you should believe. And that has been seeping into our culture for a long time. But what it does is it really, the counter reaction to that is confusion. The counter reaction to that is like, we don't know what to believe anymore. If your truth is your truth and you say this table doesn't exist, like, oh, who am I to step on your truth? You go, we have lost all grounding in reality. And I think in the postmodern thought starts to really break down. And with the internet and everything else, like with ideas flying around as fast as they've been flying around the last 20 years, eventually people are going to go, that mindset is a little crazy. Like, well, I can't say there's no truth because there is a book here and there is a table here. Like, and so I think that affected culture a ton, but it seeped into the church in a huge way. So we started kind of de-emphasizing things like, I don't want to make you offended, you know? And I've been lately really thinking through, you know, becoming a Christian in the 90s, thinking through like, what did we do wrong in the 90s and 2000s? Because there was a significant, like we adapted this postmodern thought. We started this like emergent church movement where some of it was great, you know, but some of it was like, eventually you just start, like a lot of those leaders eventually just threw the Bible out completely because life
it was
all
to,
you know.
Exactly. And it was all to draw people in, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's my personal belief. And we can get into a little bit of this because this is kind of exciting, but I think
do
like
what we want.
Yeah, exactly. I think like that 90s, early 2000s, I mean, I started going to church in like 2006, seriously. Yeah. Like, that sounds funny to say probably to you because I'm so, But, I mean, even then, right? Like, it was still like we were getting into this, like, I feel like, just my personal opinion, this no man's land of like what works for, you know, evangelism and stuff like that. So you had a lot of like, the Lifehouse skits and stuff like that to like pull on the heartstrings. And where I'm from, you know, more so in the deep South, you have like this idea of like hell houses, right?
You're not
like
from
a Halloween,
Phoenix.
right? I'm not. I'm from Oklahoma City. But you have this like these ideas. I've never been to one, but like the hell houses, right, around Halloween. Like we're gonna literally scare kids into not going to hell.
Yes.
Which is like.
Okay.
Yeah, I never really connected. Like we've kind of borrowed this idea of like postmodernism and like an evangelical emergent church, right?
Yes.
Where we're like, we need to get people, right?
Yes.
And maybe maybe the sentiment was like good, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're starting to see a lot of the fruit of that now. I mean, within the past 5 years, right? Like deconstructionism is like a whole topic, and you have ideas around purity culture and stuff like that. Because once we gather all these people and kind of facetiously trick them into believing in Jesus, like, okay, like how are we going to disciple them, right?
Totally.
So, which like now I'm going through my own discipleship process. I'm like, this looks wildly different than what I was taught in youth group or whatever. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's funny because it seems a little bit, so there's a little bit of modernism seeping in there as a counter reaction to postmodernism, which is interesting because you think about the Hell House, for example, like this is classic, like, modern man, I can control this. If I just do this, then I'm going to make them believe this, you know. And that is really not an idea you see anywhere. I mean, Jesus, I was talking to the staff about this recently, but Jesus, when he had a huge crowd in front of him, and this happens pretty often, Jesus has this huge crowd in front of him, and you would think this is the height of his ministry. Like, and sort of our generation of church leaders, like, this is your moment. Like, this is your moment to give the best sermon ever. To like, and if he wants to preach the gospel, this is the moment to make it super clear. And Jesus stands in front of the thousands of people, and he says, a farmer sowed seed, and he threw some on the ground here, and it didn't grow. And this, and, you know, the weeds choked it out. And over here it grew, and it produced 100-fold. He doesn't even explain what that is. He doesn't explain like what he's talking about. And he says, he who has eyes to see, let him see. And he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he walks off stage. And you're like, basically he's like, if you get it, you get it. And if you don't, you don't. And then what's crazy is later on, he told the disciples, he's like, I was talking in parables because I really wanted to like make sure that they were pursuing truth like that. And they were confused by it. And he's like, great. Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for, you know? And this is so contrary to the, let's convince them into heaven. Let's, you know, it's very different than our current way of doing church, which is a little bit of a side note in terms of this pursuing of truth. But it's very different than let's just present the gospel. And let's present it not as the quick fix to make your life better, but we have to communicate to people, you're sacrificing a lot. You're giving up your life for Jesus. Now, what you get in return is greater, and we're followers of Jesus, and we're telling you, trust us, it's better than what you're giving up. But at the same time, like, our job is not to, like, people, and even Jesus, this is what's so shocking about Jesus, is his job is not to make people decide about him. That's their job.
Right.
You know, he presents them with, here's what it is.
Right.
And if you get it, and if you see it, and if you have eyes to see it, great. If you don't, then you don't, you know? And I think that, again, it's kind of this like modernism seeping into it. And maybe just because the church is slow in adapting some of these things. But so that modernism was still like running into the church, and probably a lot more maybe in the South. Maybe it lingered a little bit longer. On the West Coast, though, like, I got saved here in Arizona, and it seemed like there was a postmodernism that was seeping into the culture right around, into church culture in the 90s, which would make sense. Right. The church is like 30 years behind culture. Whether good or bad, it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of the way it is. So then you start to see the emergent church, and the emergent church kind of happening at the same time as, oh my gosh, what's Bill Hybels' church? Why am I drawing a blank? Anyway, Hybels Church in New York, or in Chicago. And there's all these churches that are like seeker sensitive. They're putting on more of a big production for people. And then you have on the other side sort of these the emergent church people that are doing the same thing, if we're being honest. They're de-emphasizing truth so that they can hang out with people on the streets, and they're talking more about justice, which people in the world go, oh, I like that too, you know? Both of them were trying to carve off pieces of Christianity that they thought made it more palatable for people. And they were looking for people to go, oh, wow, actually this does make sense. Oh, wow, I actually do believe that, you know? But when you see Jesus talking and preaching, and you see Paul preach, like, they're not trying to say, hey, let's carve out some pieces you don't like. They're just never doing that. But they are abandoning themselves for the gospel, and they're sacrificing a lot, and that's sticking out to people. And not only that, but there were people physically, you know, in Acts when he preaches the gospel to people, there were people that were there that saw Jesus resurrected, and they were like, I'm already convinced. I saw it happen. So can you tell me what to do here? You know? So it's different. I mean, people love to point to Acts 2 and say, let's just go back to that. You know, it's not so simple. But I do think, as I'm looking back at the past season, there is a lot of sacrifice of truth, and not just like from the conservative perspective, even on kind of the liberal perspective. Like, on both sides, you're like, either one of you, whether it's a seeker sensitive in a wealthy neighborhood or a justice oriented, like, we're gonna de-emphasize the Bible and talk more about social justice and things like that. They were both diving into postmodernism, whether they were aware of it or not. And they were going, we don't want to make uncomfortable conversations. Your truth is your truth, and maybe some of our truth can leak into your truth, and then eventually you might get around us enough that you become Christian. And it didn't work. I mean, honestly, Nathan and I had a conversation, Nathan on our team this morning, and we were talking about church leadership, and, you know, his history working with Hillsong, and me doing Outcry and some of those things. It's like, we saw some of the baby boomer leadership things that fell apart. And at some point, their idea was not really, like, they started to get clouded and going, well, I'm not trying to bring you the gospel. I'm trying to get better book sales next time. And I'm trying to, you know, like, and again, all of this happens, like, if I stand, and I realize this on Outcry, if I stand in front of everybody and I go, Jesus is awesome, isn't he great? And everyone goes, yeah, and they cheer. If I stand in front of everybody and I go, where are you, like, pursuing idols in your life? Are you idolizing money? You really shouldn't. It's going to hurt you.
Which is like a nice way to say it, right?
Yes,
like,
it's a nice way to say it. Yeah.
Are you greedy?
Right? Are you greedy and hoping in your money?
I idolize Jesus, which is like justifiable, right? But
and as a speaker, I understand that, like, the temptation there. Like, this last Sunday, was not an applause Sunday. It was like you could hear a pin drop in the room Sunday.
Yeah.
And everything in me wants to get to like, oh, let's soften the room. Let's soften this.
Yeah.
Let's joke. Let's laugh a little bit. But I also think it's a disservice. So coming full circle, this is, I think, in the church, as we're pursuing truth, it's inevitably in this sort of postmodern saturated culture, it's inevitably going to push us into a place that we're not only offending people, but we're inviting people's anger onto us. And we're not trying to do that. We're not going out of our way. There's those people that like go to the pro-choice rallies and they just wear the most like heinous thing. Like that's not what I'm talking about. But when you simply hold fast to things that are true, and you, as a church leader, are trying to lead your congregation in that, because there are people in the room that I might say, hey, transgender ideology has crossed some bad lines lately. And this is not just us going, we're caring for people with gender dysphoria. That's a thing. We should care for people with gender dysphoria.
Yes.
But when we see this leaking into our kids and our school and the Christians that are trying to live and let live and let's just like, I don't want to rock the boat at all. It's becoming harder and harder to do that. And as a parent, like my kids right now, it got to the point where I was going, I need to take them out and put them into Christian school. And I think 1990s and early 2000s, Ryan, would be like, no, stay in the culture. Like, be missional in your culture.
Yeah.
And I just had a realization. I'm like, well, it's one thing if I expect to be missional in my life, or if I expect my kids to be missional toward their friends. Okay.
Right, exactly.
But to expect them to do that to the authority figures in their life and in second grade it's not wise. This is not wise. And wisdom tells me as a parent that there is a difference between being missional and putting my kids in a place where they're going to be indoctrinated in something that I deeply disagree with, that I actually think is going to cause them pain and a lot of confusion. And this is one example in 1,000 in the times that we live in, where churches are starting to go, well, the tactic of not bothering people with it or making it seeker sensitive or really impressing you with a great show or like we see the failures of that. Like it didn't work.
It's lots of Lester, right? And we talked a lot about kind of the internet and Gen Z and that kind of thing. And I think the thing that I'm seeing with like take your most like stereotypical Gen Z, they might like communicate in meme language, right?
Sure, yeah.
Your son with like that's cringe, right?
Yes,
and I like
that's cringe.
Yeah.
So like meme.
Vibe, for sure.
Yeah.
But the one thing that Gen Z is pretty good at is spotting fakes.
Yes.
Immediately.
Yep.
Right. And I think it's because like we were talking in your office, I think last week, like, as millennials growing up with the internet, it was just fun all the time. It was a place to just have like fun and overshare on Facebook and post your, your lunch on Twitter or whatever. And then we're starting to see it like evolve into like, whatever fake news being spread on Twitter. And then like there starts to be like serious consequences to it, right?
Sure.
Whether it's the detriment of us or not.
So
like there's serious actions, right? Like people are getting super upset that Elon jokingly was going to buy Twitter. He actually had to do it.
Did it.
Now Twitter's horrible. Like there's consequences to like kind of like just like there was no other way to go but like this kind of dependency on the internet, right?
Yes.
So like millennials, growing up having fun with the internet, and then it changed, right? Yeah. And then now I think what Gen Z, like, because they can spot fakes so easily and they're just like desperate for truth. Yeah. I think that's why we're seeing such a, like, whether it makes you annoyed or not, like the deconstructionist kind of, TikTok videos about like how like purity culture like ruined my marriage now that I'm an adult or whatever, which are all valid stories, right? But like, I think what we're seeing is the fruit of so much catering and so much like, I don't know how to articulate it. So much, maybe you can help me. But like so much of like almost too much of a good thing, right?
Yes.
And then now there are serious consequences. So we're seeing
Absolutely.
Gen Z start to react to that,
Yes.
right? Which
Yep.
we like to think Gen Z is like the most snowflakey, right? Like
Yes.
I'm using like hot button terms like that you see on Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
But really, like I see Gen Zs like as a generation, like especially the followers of Jesus coming out of Gen Z, like they don't want, like they want the Bible.
They want it. Yes.
They don't want,
and I think
they
that
don't
brings
want
us to
secular songs. They don't want
Exactly.
Coldplay in church.
Yes,
like
exactly.
they really don't.
They don't.
You know?
No.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us into like, so I think that there's a new season that's upon us, and I've been diving into this a lot on YouTube, getting a YouTube education on it, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad, but there's a new sort of movement happening that people are naming meta-modernism.
Right.
So this is postmodernism.
Yeah.
And this is like we're figuring this out.
Yeah.
Metamodernism is kind of defined by a culture that doesn't really take itself too seriously.
Right.
So they post these memes that are like low quality. That's like that's what they do. Like, and that's the aesthetic that they're trying to avoid fancy aesthetic, but walking into a new aesthetic, which we've talked about. But that's design nerdy conversation. But really, there's this kind of counter reaction to postmodernism that's interesting, and we're all kind of watching it play out. So I would even say, like, I mildly disagree with you that Twitter is worse now with Elon. I think that what it is it's completely open and unfettered. And so I think metamodernism, this is what's so strange, is it's a mixture of postmodernism where they go, okay, well, we don't like to have deep, like, theology disagreements and things like that. It still seems to be a postmodern thought that's leaking into this next generation. They are far more comfortable talking about transgenderism or things like that the older generation was really uncomfortable talking about. But then you bring up following Jesus or religion in this secular, the newer secular age, they're kind of like, ooh, I still am uncomfortable with that. So a lot of that is still postmodern thought leaking into it.
Right.
But there is a new sort of strain. Metamodernism is also this incorporation of modernism into postmodernism. Right. And even pre-modernism. So it's like this full circle where they're going, there are so many opinions. So Twitter is, because they kind of opened up the boundary conditions of speech, it's like anything can be said on that within reason. I mean, you're not hearing death threats and things like that, but pretty much compared to everything else, it's pretty open. The reaction against that is we have to know what's true. Like we can't, and people throw around the phrases like misinformation or disinformation, and what they don't realize is it's a counter reaction to postmodernism is what they're asking for. Right. They're going, all truth can't be truth. Like we are so chaotic on the inside of our soul that we need somebody to tell us what's true or not. Right. Which we've been experiencing at Living Streams on the positive side, where people, Gen Z's coming here and going, Don't lie to me. Don't like sugarcoat it. Don't just tell me what's going on in the world. Tell me how to sift through it. Yeah. Tell me what's true. Tell me what's not true. Even if I don't agree with you, it's refreshing for me to hear some clarity. I think on the other side, without that, when people aren't going to the church for that, they're going, please, media and government, just control what's being said so that I don't have to worry about whether it's true or not. Like that, and I don't have to sift through 8 million different perspectives on this. I could just kind of go to this one perspective that's trusted. And now I think that leads to some dangerous places because, again, that these people in government are somehow higher than us or they understand more than us. I think it's kind of like, well, you're relying on humans again to try to make your life easier and to edit this out for you. But what we're really, and it's the technological age that we are in, we are left to sift through a lot of opinions. And I think in some ways we can, and there's a lot more about metamodernism. That's interesting. You know, it's very interesting. There's so many, like it's this mixture of postmodern, I almost said theology. Actually, in some ways it is kind of postmodern.
Well, that's
theology.
what you had said, right? You're like, there's almost a rejection of discussion of theology. And it's like, well, depends on what I guess you define as theology, right? Because there could be a secular theology that you subscribe to, this idea that, you know.
So then that leaves us with, so as Christians, we're not immune from this. So we hear the noise, we hear what's going on. Some voices are telling us, just shut out the noise. Some voices are saying, well, just pay attention to this part of the noise, the right or the left side of the noise, or whatever. I think honestly there is an in-between that we're to walk that's a little more messy.
Explain that.
So like you and I were talking about the idea that so a lot of people right now, and I don't mean to chuckle at it because I think for some people this is really true. Did we talk about this in the podcast? The two different people. Did we talk about this before we hit record or?
Two different people. I'm not sure.
Okay, all right. So
just explain it.
Yeah. So there's like a couple of people that I see right now in the world. One is the people that are saying, I don't want to pay attention because it's just too sad and it's just too hard.
Yes.
And so, and I get that to some extent, you know. And we talk about mental health, and our church, we care about mental health, and there is like a level of, hey, don't dive into that too far. But then the pay attention to yourself on why you're asking that is so important.
Yeah.
So why are you uncomfortable hearing what's going on? Because a lot of the things people just don't want to hear, not even just the two opinions about it, or I don't even know if I could sift through the truth versus the untruth, you know. A lot of it is just the things that we all know is true and we all know is happening. And people are going, I can't drag myself to pay attention to it, you know. And my challenge to us this last Sunday is, why is that? You know, what is it inside of you that's reacting against it? And that is the thing that is so important. And the phrase that I used, which Alec really was the one that brought this, and I love this phrase, but he talked about when Jesus invited Peter to walk on the water. And he says, come out to me, you know. And Jesus, when he first shows up, there's a storm going on. The disciples think he's a ghost. Like everyone's like, I don't know what the heck is going on. Like, talk about chaos. You don't understand what's happening. And Jesus says, come walk out to me. None of the other disciples, they're all just like, yeah, right. I could sense them. Like, I could picture them just like, I'm just gripping onto this boat and like trying not to fall out.
Yeah.
Like, I'm
maybe
not gonna,
thankful that they're not the
yes,
ones
they're
called.
like pretending they didn't hear him say that or something, you know, like, Peter, you know, has this sort of beautiful childlikeness in his faith. And he goes, okay, I'm going to come out to you, you know, and he starts walking on the waves. And what Jesus doesn't do is he doesn't calm the waves. Right. He doesn't go, let me make this water real glassy for you and like look at you like a baby and go, come on, Peter, you got it, you got it. He just goes, come out to me, you know. And Peter walks on the waves and he walks on the chaos. And I think as followers of Jesus, when we look at the things that, and again, separating maybe the noise of postmodernism, the noise of all the different opinions about things, things that we know are fact. There's a war going on in Ukraine. Russia and America, there are tensions rising between the two nations, and Russia and China are getting together a lot more. And we're going, okay, we know that's going on. Right. Financial things, like we were talking about, there are financial things going on that are different than we've ever experienced throughout history. And for people paying attention, we should be like, hey, pay attention to this. Be concerned about this a little bit, you know. But there are the Christians that tread on that chaos and they go, I know those things are happening and I'm still fine. You know, I don't lose any sleep about it. Right. I hear about this thing that's going on and I know that Jesus said there's wars and rumors of wars. Like we say that phrase like it doesn't mean anything. But now we're experiencing it. And to say, what if we went to war with a nuclear power? And the more we think about what that means, many of us emotionally are like, can't handle that. like, I can't handle that. That's just too much. Literally me. It's just too much. Yeah. And I do think, and I get that. I totally get it. But I think the challenge for us in this season is, can we look at that, and can we look at that and say, Lord, help me to unwind or pull my root system out of the world a little bit more, because I've been operating out of this come on attitude, or maybe it's the American pride attitude that I'm sorry, I think it's hitting liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter. When you're in America, when you have this mindset that says that could never happen here, it is a false comfort. And if something changes, it won't help you. that is like that mindset is not something that will help you. So what does help you? Well, having a kingdom first mindset helps you, because you go, hey, no matter what happens, I'll be fine. Like, no matter what's going on. And for those of us that are parents, that's extra hard. I look at my kids and I go, man, I'm so sorry. You're inheriting a world that's going to be really tough. Like, I don't know exactly how it's going to be tough, but I get a sense it's going to be really tough for you. But at the same time, I look at Christians. I spent some time in China, and I remember the underground church in China. So like, especially at this time, it's kind of early 2000s. This was before, it's gotten a lot worse lately. Right. But there was kind of an openness. Like the church was allowed to do church things. Right. But you had to register with the government, and they had to kind of sign off on what you were doing. And if they did, then you're free to do whatever. Right. The group that I was working with, they were not free to do with it, whatever. They were underground, and they were up on the 10th story of this big building in Guangzhou, which was near Wuhan. And I actually flew through Wuhan before anybody cared what Wuhan was. Yeah. But they were on the 10th floor, and they had cameras on the first floor, and they had desks that they were studying the Bible on. And if they saw like government officials coming in on the first floor, they knew they had 10 floors because they didn't have an elevator. Right, they had 10 floors to get everything set up. Right. And they had their Bibles glued to tables that they would rotate. And they had bowls glued on the other side. And then they would start throwing food into it. And they'd start making, so by the time the guy got to the 10th floor, they were like, oh, we're just cooking up here, you know. And why do I say that? Well, those church leaders were not getting 401ks. Right. They were not getting paid to do ministry. They were working side jobs, and they were so dedicated to the gospel. And the kind of American mindset says, oh, well, that sounds terrible. Oh, you're not getting paid? That sounds really hard. Right. That must be hard on your mental health and some other things like that. And I think on the contrary, when you see them, you go, there's something more real about that church than my church. Like they are not only believing it, but they've already resigned in their mind, I might go to prison. I might die. I might go to prison for the rest of my life, and who knows what's going to happen to me in there. They've already surrendered their life. And so they're going, well, what else do I have to lose at this point? You know, Americans have yet to go through something like that, you know. And a lot of people in the West, I don't mean to just poke at Americans, but Western culture in general, we've had such a level of comfort that...
there's a threshold. I think it was threshold of, I can't remember where I heard it from, but threshold of like uncomfortability, right? So like we make comparisons. I think most of the time they're fair. I think sometimes, you know, like people legitimately go through like hard times in America, right?
100%. There are poor people in America. There are people that go through really difficult times.
For sure. But
death and family, all of these things, it's not to minimize that sort of pain. Absolutely.
But when you know, make a comparison, like the congruency of like their threshold for uncomfortability, right? Yes. Here, it's probably something like my card doesn't work on Apple Pay, and I had to get my wallet out, and it was really annoying. You know, like it can sometimes be unfair because like you can just strike that kind of like argument, you know, to in the spectrum. But I think it really is a product. I really do think it was just kind of going back to like the comfortability that we've been sold as Americans, American dream, right? Nuclear family, that comfortability that we've just grown so used to because of thriving times of post-war era, whatever. Yeah, I mean, and we've talked a little bit about, you know, maybe we need to be more open to the idea of America maybe not being the greatest empire on the face of the planet, and maybe it's someone else, which is scary to a lot of people. I know, especially
there's little moments. You know, I was listening to Antony Blinken from our Secretary of State, and he said, you know, I call Saudi Arabia every other week, and I tell them like they need to legalize gay marriage and they need to like push LGBTQ rights, and I was going, wow, okay. So this is what America's pushing, and other countries are going, no. Like, and it's funny because even European countries are going, you guys have gone a little too far. Like, we're not following you there, you know. And there are these moments where I turned to my wife and I was like, kind of think we're in the wrong here. We are foisting a weird morality on other countries right now. Like, that's strange and that's new. And, these are all things that as Christians, we have to become a little more comfortable talking about, because we go, these are little, like I call them little early warning signals. Like, hey, we should really pay attention to this. And there are times where, like, creating some clarity is always so important. So for me, a question that brings clarity is this: if for whatever reason our government turned radically against Christianity, and they said, if you go to church, and I'm not talking about COVID, I'm not talking about anything now, just on the religion of the state versus Christianity, if they said, you go to church, we're going to arrest you, would you go? And I think, and maybe it's just me, but there's a stubbornness in me that goes, absolutely. Like, and it's not just going to church, it's this. If somebody asks me, do you believe in Jesus? And if you say no, you get to live and you have a great life. If you say yes, then you go to prison, This is not, again, the pride of Americans. This is not unique. Like, this is not this has happened many, 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 many times throughout history. There's been many Christians that stood in front of people and knowing that it's the death penalty, or knowing that their kids are going to grow up without a father, whatever it is. And they stand in front of them and they say, yes, I do believe that. You don't do that with a political Christianity. You don't do that with a feel-good Christianity or a seeker-sensitive Christianity. You just don't. And I think that's part of the weird foundation that we've built lately, that we go, if it's built on how you feel, if it's built on this cultural comfort that we've enjoyed as Americans for generations, if it's built on this idea that, oh, America's great and blessed and everything that she does is going to work out great. It's like, that's not the case right now. And we all kind of feel it and know it to some extent, And the question every church leader asks is, okay, well, how much do I talk about that? How much, like, I want transcendent gospel. I do want people to hear about Jesus in a new way. And I think that there is this, that's why I said there's these kind of two people. There's the people that are burying their head in the sand because they're going, this is poking at something in me that makes me really uncomfortable. And in the pursuit of people not wanting to feel bad, a lot of us have empathy for that, and I get that, but there's part of me that goes, well, I think some of that, and this is just a question I have with the Lord. This isn't by no means this is what's happening, but maybe the Lord's given us a little bit of pain. Maybe he's letting us feel a little bit of, how do I want to say it? A little bit of grief, even to some extent, as culture's changing, and we go, wow, there's some things about America that were so bad. But I think about my kids, and I go, well, I am kind of bummed that, like, the world I grew up in was a little more simple, and theirs is not. They make a mistake, and it's not like, oh, their friends heard it. It's that it gets immortalized in social media now, which I've experienced with my son. He makes a mistake, and you go, it's now screen capped and everywhere, right. So like these sort of things, and you just say the wrong thing or you do the wrong thing. And to put that pressure on a teenager or somebody who's like 12, you're like, this is sad. I'm so sorry you're growing up in this sort of culture, And so I think in this season, especially since 2020, I've allowed myself a certain level of grief, if that makes sense. I've allowed myself hey, that's okay to feel sad about that, It's okay to... it's okay to say, gosh, I wish my kids were growing up in a simpler time. Or it was a lot easier to be a church leader 10 years ago. In some ways it really was, you know. But at the same time, then that should push you into going, okay, well, the Christian side of me, maybe the American side of me is a little sad. Maybe the comfortable side of me, the Western Ryan, is like, it's a bummer. Like, I wish this wasn't the case. The Christian side of me, though, is just fine, right. And we need that. And I know it's not necessarily great. Like, I'm not advocating for, like bipolar Christians everywhere, but a little bit of that is healthy. A little bit of that is like don't protect yourself from feeling sad too much. Right. Like let yourself feel a little sad. But I think it's the goodness of the Lord to let us feel a little bit of pain, so that if something catastrophic does happen, and our neighbors who are like, they weren't paying attention to anything, they were just going to work and they weren't going to church, they didn't know what was going on, and all of a sudden some bedrock thing in their life, like the financial system or war or whatever, something breaks out and they go, I haven't gone through any mourning for this. I think the Lord is preparing a certain amount of people, and I don't know if this makes sense, a certain amount of people to kind of go through the grieving now so that they could be a strength for people later. And this is not a call for every Christian to just feel crappy all the time. Like, that's not what I'm advocating for.
Or even just like live with rose-colored glasses on, right?
Yeah. And again, there's some beautiful in between.
Right.
Like, we can't just live with rose-colored glasses. Like, there's some phrases I hear people go, I just don't pay attention to that stuff. I just trust the Lord with it. And you go, okay, I hear you. And that sounds really great. But I think there's an in-between. I think there's an in-between where you go, well, but also don't let the sort of sarcastic, snarky, prideful part of America lull you into thinking that we won't feel any pain again. That's not healthy for you either. And I think I think it's the grace of the Lord to give it to us in this time. And that's why I said discerning truth is so important for us to really discern, like, what are the things that I do need to pay attention to? And what are the things that I need to go, I don't need to worry about that, you know? And I think that's the real question. Those are the things that we're really asking ourselves. What do we look at that really does matter? And I think if we could do anything universally that helps us in the next season, it's to have more of a kingdom-minded mindset. And I know it sounds like a bumper sticker, but it absolutely has to become more than a bumper sticker for us in this season. It has to be a, Jesus, what did you say? Well, you said that we are going to be persecuted for our faith. Americans, maybe we got made fun of in a class. Like, we haven't really gone through persecution yet. Does that mean that America is immune to persecution? No.
Well, that was going to be my big.
Of course not.
That was going to be my big question. Was like, do you think Christians in America are actually persecuted, or are they feeling a certain, maybe their comfortability threshold start to kind of
they're feeling their comfortability threshold lower. They're feeling shots across the bow, and I think you could be in the camp of. Oh my gosh, we've endured so much persecution in America. I would say that's
Do you think it's
not true.
Do you think it's disingenuous? Well, I know the answer to this question. I'm setting it up like pretty loaded.
You're like, Ryan, answer this question.
How about let's just switch it from a question to a statement?
Great, yeah.
I feel like it's disingenuous to fearmonger for the sake of Christianity,
100%.
and I felt like we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, right? Like we're not allowed to go to church anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, there were, areas where that was true to a certain degree, but it wasn't like, the Giussapos knocking on your door. Are you guys having church in there? It wasn't like that, right? But I think you said it so well, was like, we're not immune to it. Yeah. Right. So, and I feel
that's a good example of like, so like we were taking that one week at a time, and I remember, this is not a story I've shared very often, but in the lead up to my last book coming out, there were some leaders that were in Washington, D.C., and I got an invite from the White House to come to the White House. March 25th, I think, 2020 was my invite date, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. So this was December 2019, and I'm going, wow, this is nuts, And then quarantine happened, and it was like, holy crap, what just happened? And I remember, you could say what you want about Trump or whatever. I was honored. I was honored to be invited to the White House. I was like, this is going to be so amazing. And I'm like, what do you wear when you go to the White House? Blake and I were like, I don't even know what to do, And as the days started getting closer and closer, it started to become like a hard realization. This is not going to happen. This is not going to happen.
Yeah. Wasn't March 23rd like day zero?
I can't remember what it was. Yeah, it was literally a few days after that. I was like, this is not going to happen. And we were all trying to figure it out. And I remember when we closed living streams, and even to say closed is not necessarily, I think, what we did, but we were very much listening to health officials and going, we don't know how bad this is. And I remember instead of the visit to the White House, we got like a phone call. There's a group of us.
A Zoom link.
Yeah, we actually didn't even get a Zoom link at the time. Nice. It's like Zoom wasn't even like up to speed yet.
Yeah.
So we got like a phone call, and it was like Pence talked to us, and then Donald Trump talked to us, and then a couple other people. And really what it was is, and the prevailing attitude was, we don't know. This thing looks like it has upwards to a 30% mortality rate, and that is insanely high, you know. And even if it's like, you know, lower, we still have to be so careful. So all of us said, okay, fine, you know. And I think at that time we made a lot of people upset, and we were like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, this seems like,
Well, it
was the beginning of the side picking, yes.
Yeah.
So
well, picking a side is in air quotes. I mean, yeah.
So, and then to say something that is like a little more controversial, but then it was like, as COVID progressed, we realized, okay, well, it's hurting some people pretty bad, but for the rest of us, there's this is not a 30% mortality. This is a less than 1% mortality. So can we come back? But we'll do you remember this, every other row, and we were wiping it down, and everyone's wearing masks and all that. So then we open, and people get mad at us again. And it was like gosh, this is, and that was when we did the bitter joke of, I guess if everyone's mad at us, then we're probably doing the right thing.
Yeah.
You know? Now, you know, I would say it crossed the line when you look at places like Canada or a few of those other places where you go, okay, well, at some point when you do have the Canadian, you know, military arresting people for going to church and barricading the church and putting chains on it, that would start to cross a line for me where I'd start to go, oh, wow, this is different. You know, this is, and we didn't go, like in Phoenix, we didn't go through that, you know. Really, most places in America didn't really go through that.
Yeah, I hesitate to even comment like on that time period because we like, you know, church switched to online, so my job was very much important at that time. So
you went to a peripheral character in our story to like the central character in our story.
No, whatever.
No, that was insane.
Thank you very much. But
the brain forgets pain, but we endured a lot of pain in that season, and by we I mean you.
It just feels like I hesitate to comment like on, you know, like my job was incredibly like tasking at that point, you know, me and Nick or so for sure.
Yeah.
And even you guys as leadership too, but it's such a weird time period to discuss. And when people ask me like, did you stay, like, how did you like work from home with your job? It's like, I really didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, we came in with limited staffing or limited people, you know, we're like clicking people at the door, you know, no more than 15 or whatever.
And then I was trying to like test everyone's temperature as they came in, and it would say like error 90% of the time. I'm like, these stupid things.
Yeah. So like, it's just, it's a hard time to describe because I feel like, you know, while a lot of people were even laid off during that time, when I know a lot of people my age that were, or working from home, still working from home, I feel like I never really got a break. not that it's a break.
And here's the principle to learn from that. You remove the quarantine, you remove Republicans and like you remove all of that. The thing to learn is that the world is not as stable as we think it is, and it can change fast. For some people, and I would say depending on how much people's peace is wrapped into the stability of America, for some people that realization is shocking. And for some people that really knocks them loose emotionally. And I think 2020 knocked us all emotionally loose because we all learned that. We all said, despite what you think about the pandemic, no matter what you think about politics, we learned this big lesson that things can change on a dime. And it affected us on a very deep level, whether we're aware of it or not.
Right.
And since then, it's like everybody has a wound and they're walking around with it and they're like, oh, no, I don't have a wound, I'm fine. You know, and you're like, but you look like you're bleeding. You're like, I don't know, it's fine, you know. And we but dove into mental health and some of those things that are really important. But But I think primarily what it is it's a grace of God to remind us of the fragility of the systems of the world, because that was never part of the deal. Like, Jesus never promised that the systems of the world are always going to be around and we could rely on them like clockwork.
Haven't they always failed?
They always fail.
We learn about empires coming, into the most powerful nations, and then, when there's a great rise, there's inevitably always a great fall.
Isn't that interesting? Like, even in Rome and Roman culture, and toward the end of Roman culture, like their money was stretched very thin, which sounds familiar. They became very obsessed with gender and dressing in the opposite gender, which is very interesting, right before the end of Rome. And you could sense that, and I'm not saying this is the end of America. I'm just saying, like, you can sense sometimes, like, where it's like we're on a bicycle and we hit a rock in 2020 and we're like, well, we're a little bit wonky. And I remember, like, teaching my kids and watching them ride the bike, and they'd hit something and they'd get a little wonky, and then you go, are you going to make it? Are you going to make it? And then they'd bounce back.
Right.
Sometimes they wouldn't. Yeah. And their tire would go more and more crazy, and they'd start swinging further and further. Yeah. And in some ways, I feel like that's what we're feeling in our culture right now. Like, the bike is swerving crazily, if we're being honest. And it's not the same way as 2020. It's not like, hey, I show up at work and I'm preaching on Sunday. Like, there is still a lot of normalcy. But emotionally, spiritually, even geopolitically, things are starting to shift all over the place. And I think as church leaders, a lot of times we think, oh, well, let's just ignore it and preach through it. But I think this is one of those seasons where we have to preach into it. I think we have to go, hey, we're all feeling this, right? Like, I'm not alone in feeling this. And you throw on things, take out geopolitics even, you throw things like AI in there, you throw things like, technology as it's going right now. And when you don't have a moral framework as a society, which we don't, we have a postmodern moral framework, which is pretty wild, And so this guy that's creating AI, or, I'm figuratively, I know there's many people working on AI, but these people that are working on AI, if this is a very great example of, if morality is not a part of what they do, we could be creating something that's incredibly powerful, and that's only gets its morals from us, which is scary. You're like, you're getting right and wrong from us, And so there's this ever increasing, and the way I said it is, it's kind of like this ever increasing moral chaos that we're seeing around us. I even don't want to use the word decay. It's not. I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of like I think I'm sorry. Like, the baby boomer phrase for it would be like moral decay. And things, I think it's a moral chaos. I think, and there's a difference. Like, it's we're over here now, and then we're over here now, and we're over here now, and we're over here now. And it's like, we can't keep up. And even the people who are on the leading edge of pop culture, and they're the most trendy people.
How intersectional are you going to get, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And at some point, nobody lines up anymore. And this is the thing that's so hard. Alec and I talked about it in the last podcast, but we tend to think that there is a secular culture that's a lot more like, oh, you do what you want to do. You do you, and all of that. And it's real gracious. And actually, it's a ruse. And it's more judgmental than Christianity. It's more graceless than Christianity. You say the wrong thing and you step out of line in the wrong way, you never get redemption again. You made a mistake, and like I said, it gets immortalized in a screen cap or something. You can never pay or atone for that sin. And this is our culture right now, And so everybody's walking on eggshells. They know if I say something out of bounds, or I say something that's in bounds, but in 2 years it's out of bounds, which I don't know what that's going to be. I might be out, And how of the enemy is that? And I think that that's ultimately like, why are we trying to discern truth? Because there are systems of the world that are graceless on us. There are systems of the world that we think that in a postmodern thought is like, oh, the free-flowing hippie. You just do whatever you want.
Right.
What we're realizing is that was a lie. Eventually, that leads to a place where they need the government to make it happen. They need whatever it is to reinforce these new morals that they've built. And there is a moral code in America, and it's not a Christian moral code. And for Christians to understand that, I think there's so many people that are like white-knuckling, 4th of July version of America.
Yeah,
it's, we're all together, and it's so great. And there's some of us that are going, those days are they're
well,
gone,
and now, I would even say that's even reactionary now, right? Because we're seeing such an opposite comparison to that, right? Where it's like, like the forefather, whatever. I mean, there's truth to some of this, but like, our forefathers, as far as America, racist, and they were, and then you have the patriotic, that they were all Christians, which wasn't true, so you get this like weird modulated sense of like, a reactionary, based on either side. I don't know. It melts my brain, honestly, and that's why it's so easy for me to fall into that apathetic, apolitical.
And I can get that, and I think you could go too far in it, and sometimes it's like you have to kind of go, okay, is there a voice of somebody who's paying attention that I can trust that will edit some of that for me, And in some ways I felt like that responsibility because I know I'm a person who really pays attention. And out of the 8,000 things that I would see that I'd go, oh my gosh, there's like 2 that I'm like, okay, we really should look at those, And I think for those of us that are trying to find truth, we have to do that. But the framework for understanding truth. So I think even, when you look at phrases that's thrown around like Marxism, and that's Marxist, and then there's some organizations that come out and go, yeah, we are Marxists. No, what's the problem with that? If you study the life of Marx, you start to go, this guy's horrible, like just horrible, like. He had suicide pacts with his kids. Like he was encouraging them to commit suicide and all of these things. Like just the more you dive into the morality of this guy, you go, this is not something we should follow, And I think that that's the key. Like when we're trying to discern, like we got to go to the root systems of this. Who is it that's saying these things?
Right.
And what's the fruit of their life? And as Christians, I do think right now we have to be real careful and real discerning. And so I started thinking of like last week, I started thinking like, what are some moral frameworks for us, And one that I talked about on Sunday was the deception framework, which is really looking at Genesis chapter 3 and going, okay, the playbook of the enemy is not new.
Right.
Like, yeah, we have the internet. That doesn't matter. The enemies of the lies of the enemy have pretty much been consistent. Did God actually say, like second guessing God, second guessing whether he has our best interests at heart, second guessing, did he actually say that thing? Maybe he didn't mean it that way. There's some sort of deep-seated, that's hard to even put into words. There's this deep-seated deception that phrase. And it's so much more effective than, don't believe God, he's an idiot. Like, did he really say that? Like that hits the heart in such a deeper way than any other question.
Right.
And when you hear those sort of things coming up, you go, okay, well, I'm starting to sniff something out, And then when he says, you will not surely die, this is a phrase that really is bringing into question the judgment of God, which we hate. Postmodern Christians, I hate to say it this way, postmodern Christians don't want to talk about Satan. We don't want to talk about judgment. We don't like that stuff. And we're like, isn't it easier to just kind of not talk about that,
When you say postmodern Christians, is that synonymous with like progressive Christianity?
Maybe. Yeah, okay. I think progressive Christianity is the fruit of postmodernism leaking into the church. Okay. But like in the way that we are talking about the you do you,
but when
I don't
you
want to
say
make you
that,
uncomfortable.
Are you kind of inferring maybe progressive
I think so
theology?
Too. Yes, okay. I think so. I think like that John Mark Comer line of progressive theology is often the last step before post-Christianity.
Yeah,
you know,
post-Christian,
secular. Yeah. So it really is, and it's something to watch out for because it sounds really good, and we've seen people succumb to that. And Alec and I talked about it a lot in that last podcast. But I've seen very well-meaning Christians that love the Lord and love people. Pick up a new book and go, oh, wow, that's interesting, you know? And now as Christians, we're not anti-information. We're not anti that. Like, we should have an answer to our faith. But when we do that alone, we are inviting the enemy to come separate us from the herd.
What do you mean when you say alone? Without what?
So without a community around you to go, well, hey, you know, I have heard about that book. Be careful. And a lot of times we get snarky about it. People will be like, oh, the Enneagram's from Satan, you know. And okay, fine.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring that up. But, you know, I've gained some great things from the Enneagram. I can also hear people say,
just kidding.
But I can also hear people say, well, the roots of it are this, and maybe you should be careful of it, and go, as a Christian, I need to remove the snarkiness out of me and just go, well, maybe that is the case. Yeah. And maybe there's something else I could lean into, you know? I'm also an INFJ. I could do that too. That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't have to be an Enneagram 3.
Well, it's kind of that idea of like everything is problematic, right?
Yes,
like if you like something, it's like, I like Hershey's. It's like, did you know the Hershey's company in 1937 killed like,
but what we can't do is allow to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Some of that is actually really good.
Oh, for sure.
I'm challenging you on something you're saying.
Yes.
Is that biblical? Is that good?
Right.
Just so you know, did you know the history of this thing?
Or do you understand the nuance or the tension that lives between? Yeah, right.
And a humble, open-handed Christian goes, oh, interesting. Well, let me take that to the Lord. That is interesting. Maybe I should be careful of that, you know? And I think that is like the progressive Christianity is built on this idea of like, come on. Don't make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
We don't want to be a Karen about things. Like, and I understand that's like, we've had a lot of that happen. I've had Karen Christians come to me and light me up about things that I go, oh, come on, you know, like, but at the same time, the iron sharpens iron of community. The challenge of community is really helpful and beautiful. When you pick up a book and you go, oh, Brian McLaurin is saying this very interesting thing, and to have somebody...
We had a visitor. It's all good.
Yeah, we had a visitor. Yeah. But to have somebody to say, hey, but did you know that Brian McLaurin also said this and this and this? And you go, oh, okay, interesting, you know. Because we're not all knowing. None of us are.
Well, we're seeing it with pastors on Instagram, you know. I mean, like, just not an opinion. Although, if you want to hear my opinion, I will. But maybe not right now. But you know, like Mike Todd at Transformation is getting, you know, a lot of heat right now for you know, maybe
you could argue
apologizing for the laws of God. I don't know why he made it like this. I wish it were different, right?
Yeah,
so,
totally.
Yeah.
And I do think it's like, and again, for a preacher, there's a reason why preaching takes so much out of people who preach, because the Bible warns not many people should want to preach.
I don't want to preach.
Because you are responsible for the things that come out of your mouth.
Yeah. Why?
And if you say,
I didn't want to share my opinion on Mike Todd just now.
But I'll just say this again. Like when Mike Todd said that. Hey, this is a great venue to talk about this. When Mike Todd said that, I go, oh, bummer. You missed it.
Yeah.
You should have. There were some things you could have done to help. Again, not just to be sensitive to people who are more progressive than you or don't like the Bible. Again, it's seeker sensitive that's leading you into this place of actually saying something kind of deceptive, of going, I wish God made it clear. Yeah. You go, well, he did. You just don't like it. And I get it. We can talk about that. And it's a nuanced thing. There are people that are going through sin, and we walk them through that. But to stand in front of the pulpit and to say that, you're responsible for it. So now you got to either clean it up. So we had a situation happen like a month or two ago, and somebody on our team said something that seemed like it was like theologically a little off. And I was sitting there in service, and I knew I was speaking after this person, and I was like, I got to say something. I got to say something. And why? Because not because I'm trying to. It's not like what is this? It's not virtue signaling. That's the word. There it is. Yeah. It's not virtue signaling. It's not just checking the box of politics or whatever. it is for the sake of clarity and the people that are in front of us in church, we have a responsibility to say, hey, this thing was said, and we don't fully agree with that, and that's important, you know?
I just think back to when you said clarity is kindness, you know?
Yes, and we're not judging them and saying, hey, you can't speak at our church anymore. Because I know this person, and they're like, I knew that they just came out sloppy.
Right, yeah.
But it coming out sloppy is the responsibility of a church leader to make sure that we reduce how often that happens.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got to think through these things. How am I going to say that, you know? And so I think that sort of, that framework in our culture right now is vital. So you've got like I'm going to come back to that frame, the moral framework of discernment. So there's the deception framework in Genesis 3. I think that's pretty simple. You know, the last one is you will be like God, which is postmodernism, really kind of in a nutshell. Like you're responsible for your own truth and your reality, and you make your own reality.
Yeah,
and
your experience is your reality and your truth. Right?
Yeah, and you can't speak to my truth, you know, and so that's pretty classic postmodernism.
Yeah.
The enemy comes in right away and goes, you'll be like God. You'll know all the stuff like him.
Right.
And Christians should be wary of that message. Like, of course I'm not God. Like, that I should be some sort of purveyor of truth is silly. Like, I need a higher standard to look at. And ultimately, we see culture doing that. They're going, we don't know where to look. So maybe it's pop culture is our higher standard for what's right and wrong. And they're not tethered to anything. But we as Christians are. And so that's actually a really peaceful place to be, to go, oh, well, let me study the Bible. Now, the Bible's messy on a lot of things. And there's not like you could pull this verse out of context, sure. But that's why we have the Holy Spirit and we have other Christians in our life. Like this is, God's given us everything that we need if we don't throw those things away. You know, the Holy Spirit's there to give you discernment.
Yeah.
Don't step all over the Holy Spirit. Don't like discount it. Don't like, I mean, there's so many Christians that are like, I read the Bible every day. And it's like, but do you listen to the Holy Spirit too? Right. Like, do you sit down and go, Lord, what do you want to say to me today? And I'm going to listen. I'm not bringing my list of wants, and I want to listen to what you have to say, because we have that helper, that discerner living inside of us.
Right.
So you got the Bible, you got the Holy Spirit, and you've got community and people going, hey, did you know that there's this, you know, some pagan roots to this thing? And then between you and the Holy Spirit and the Word of God, you could go, oh, actually, maybe that is a big deal.
Right.
And maybe I shouldn't do that, you know? That is the framework for discernment for the Christian, you know? So the other framework, and Nancy Pearcey in her other book. So this Finding Truth is a book that I would really recommend. She talks a lot about even the roots of like political correctness and all sorts of things. She has another one. Gosh, what is it called? Something Truth. I don't know. I'll think about it. It's not Finding Truth. It's.
I was gonna be like, actually, it's this, and then I just totally. Actually, let me just look it up.
Yeah, just look up Nancy Pearcey. But her other book, it like she talked about how, when you start looking at, and I said this on Sunday morning, and I feel like this needs to be said again. Total truth. There it is. There's really no such thing as pure secularism. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah, we worship something.
Yeah, that we can live in this religiously sort of sterile environment is a uniquely Christian idea, or uniquely American idea in the last couple of, maybe the last generation or two. And we thought, oh, if we could just create this environment in pop culture and movies and, even social media on Amazon, like if we have eyes to see, we start to see it everywhere. If they just remove religion, aka Christianity, ultimately, if you remove that, we can have this sterile environment that we are never challenged or uncomfortable, and it's just not true. And you could say what you want about it, but as we've removed, religious foundations in our teaching system, as we've gone to like public schools and away from private schools, as we've gone to this sort of model of let's remove Christianity from everywhere, we created a vacuum that's now being filled with things, kind of like I was saying, like all of a sudden Antony Blinken is saying stuff. You're like, you're the Secretary of the State. Why are you pressuring these nations to believe this thing? Yeah. Well, because without Jesus in there, it's being backfilled by idols. And I said this line that really, for me, it was like mind-blowing, and I read it on Sunday. I'm like, nobody's mind is blown by it. That's okay. This is for me then. But Christianity is not the response to secularism, it's the response to idolatry, always. So to battle secularism is really battling the fruit of the main issue, which is idolatry that's seeping into our culture. And we create space for that idolatry when we back out. And there's a difference between, the sort of moral majority, sort of Republican view of injecting it. I think it's something totally different. But I do think it's centered on, like parents are a great example right now. Parents are leaving the public school system and they are leaning into private schools. That, I think, is a very logical, reasonable response as a Christian parent to say, hey, if you're going to teach my kid things that are really confusing for them and things that I deeply disagree with and you're not going to care about it, then I have to take my child somewhere else. Right. And that sort of personal responsibility that a lot of times we attach to republicanism or whatever, it actually really is a Christian idea of saying, I am responsible for my kids, I'm responsible for my community, I'm responsible for my relationship with Jesus, and it's easy to blame other people, it's easy to push that off, but the sort of counter response that we're seeing, and it's important because what we are starting to see is this, again, another framework for discernment for Christians, and that framework that Nancy Pearcey talks about is the counterfeit gospel framework. Now, she says it's three things: creation, fall, and redemption. Right. I added a fourth one in there because I started to see this a lot more. So it's creation, fall, sacrifice, redemption. So this idea that we are created in the image of God, we have a fall that happens. Right. We fall from the grace of God that we could never really measure up to anyway. A sacrifice is needed throughout the entire Old Testament, comes to fruition fully through Jesus, the Messiah, who makes the ultimate sacrifice. Then he raises from the dead and he brings redemption to all of us who have made mistakes, but here we are, we've atoned or we've accepted the atonement for our sins, and now we're standing in good standing with Jesus. And to think that that's the only place that story is told is kind of silly. There is a counterfeit of that being told in our popular culture. Now, I'm going to use an example that might be a tiny bit offensive. I think it's mostly built on something good, but it slipped sideways recently. And I would say environmentalism is a really good snapshot of this in play in our current culture. Now, is environmentalism wrong? No. Are we called to just pollute the planet? No, absolutely. We're called to take care of the planet. Absolutely. Yeah. But the creation story of environmentalism is that there was this pristine earth that was really beautiful. Right. And these really ugly creatures showed up called humans, and we started really messing it up. Right. And then we started getting more greedy, and we started destroying the world even more. And Mother Earth, this pristine thing, we are now destroying. And now we have to atone for that by paying a lot more high taxes. We have to sacrifice how much we drive to work. We need to have less children. We need to maybe not have any children for the sake of the world. We need to do this. And ultimately, it's led us to this idea that the fall is humans' fault. So we are a cancer on this beautiful thing that we call Mother Earth. What do you do with cancer? You get rid of it. Yeah. You do everything you can to get rid of it. So then all of a sudden, it's crossed into this line where we go, you're the problem. You're wrong. You're evil. And you get to this point where the redemption of that sacrifice and everything leads us to, like Jeff Bezos said this thing, and I thought, this is so clarifying. It's everybody listening to him. He said, one day, the reason he's doing Blue Horizon and all this stuff, he's like, one day, if we could get humans off the earth and they could stop trashing it, we get every human off of Earth, and then some of us get to come back and visit this beautiful place occasionally. And I'm like, that is, for them, the new heaven and the new earth. The new heaven and the new earth is get out of there because you are destroying Mother Earth and you are horrible. And you go, you think the message of Christianity up until that point is rough. That is honestly, there's no redemption in it. Right. Yeah. The redemption is that you go away because you are evil, Right. And again, some of this is a little bit of an over characteristic of it, but it's becoming more and more like that. And so this, again, is a framework for Christians to look at, and we go, okay, is environmentalism wrong? No, absolutely not. Are we called to take care of the environment? Yes. But when it becomes this religious idea that starts to push me into thinking humans are cancer,
right.
I have to take a step back and go, ooh, I got to be careful not to let that into my heart too much.
Right.
Like that actually doesn't seem
Right.
conducive to the gospel,
Right.
which is people were created in the image of God.
Right.
We're very valuable. We're not a cancer.
Right.
Like there's something about each one of us that God thinks is beautiful and worth giving his son for. Like this is a deeply Christian idea that we
Right.
can't allow pop culture to push that out
Right,
in the
right.
name of going, oh, well, if you don't care about, if you care about the environment, then you don't, you know. And that is where I think, again, these are frameworks for discernment. And I love this line. Charles Spurgeon said this. He said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is knowing the difference between right and almost right. And I think this is what's so key for Christians in this time, that we have to discern the almost right. You know, that is the thing that if it's off just a little bit, you know, that compass is off just a little bit. I was reading a story. I think it's the Andrea Doria. I don't remember. It's like a famous boat that crashed. Yeah.
Okay.
And the boat crashed, and basically its compass was off by a tiny bit,
right.
and it crashed into another boat. And because he didn't set his compass right, he ended up crashing into this other boat. And you go, well, that compass is off a tiny bit, and in a mile, it's not really that big of a deal. But in 300 or 400 miles, you're like, you are off significantly,
right.
you know. And I think that's why it's the almost right. And that's why I pointed something like environmentalism, because we go, oh, it's almost right. It's almost there. But we have to be so careful. It's indicative, again, and then what is the idol in that belief system? Well, Mother Earth is kind of the idol in that belief system.
Right.
And if you hear people nowadays, they talk about the universe, or the universe is like, and Mother Earth and all these things. Ultimately, it's kind of like for whatever reason, our pop culture has become more comfortable depersonalizing God. I don't know why. Removing this personalization of God, and it's just this sort of force that's out there. It's this universe. It's the Mother Earth.
Well,
it's
can
the whatever.
you really blame him?
Yes, exactly.
It's not like, I mean, obviously we have Jesus like embodied, right? But
Sure.
like God is, it's like you can't see him.
Sure,
you know
totally.
what I mean? Like.
Well,
it's
and then,
this,
but what Nancy Pearcey says, and again, and this is where the idolatry sneaks into it. And this is a quote from Nancy Pearcey that I love. She said, "When we define God as something instead of someone, we tend to treat humans as some things too."
Yeah.
Ultimately, what we believe about God starts to seep into what we think about humans, and you see that. It's like, okay, if Mother Earth is your main priority, humans are not very high on your priority. You're like, you're hurting this thing that we think is pristine and beautiful without you, and actually you should probably just go away. You know, there's one example in like myriad of examples of where our culture sounds almost right, and it starts to leak into the church too. And we go, well, I'm not going to say anything about that. You know, at some point though, it's like we have to know those boundary conditions and go, hey, you're starting to encroach into my belief system here. And it doesn't matter how popular it is. It doesn't matter how much people are saying it. And I think it's a deeply Christian thing to be skeptical. I think Christians should go, let me sniff that out a little bit more. Oh, that's interesting. You think that that's true. Let me look into that a little bit more.
Right.
You know, the pursuit of truth, like I said in the beginning, all truth is God's truth. So if we believe that, then we are going to pursue the things that's true in any given circumstance and go, oh, well, interesting. You say that this is the case, but I want to look into it more. I want to look into that. Like, and there should be something about us that we should be wary of the enemy and wary of the world. And that's ultimately where I landed on Sunday is we are in a spiritual battle. We're not battling Joe Biden. We're not battling Donald Trump. We're not battling even postmodernism or these sort of things. Yes, we are, and yes, we should be wary. What we really are up against, though, is an enemy that's been around for a long time, and his plan is very simple. It's to steal, to kill, and destroy. That's what Jesus said. He's going to take things. He's going to steal from the gospel, and he's going to make a counterfeit. He's going to destroy humans. That's what he wants to do. He deeply hates humans created in the image of God. Like, if we downplay the fact that we're up against an enemy, I think we do ourselves a deep disservice, and we start to kind of blindly trust things in the world as if there's not an enemy in the absence of the Holy Spirit, as if there's not an enemy that's trying to sneak in there and create belief systems that steal from people, that kill them, that destroy who they are deep down. And that's where the church has such an opportunity. Yeah. And ultimately, this is my hope as we're getting further into this series. We have an opportunity to encourage one another, to remind one another that our faith is actually a reasonable faith. Yeah. And I come from and I think that the benefit is I came from a deeply skeptical of Christian perspective, a deeply, the Bible's fairy tale. That was how I kind of grew up thinking, And eventually I started to realize, no, there's actually a lot of reasonableness here. And my eyes were opened to the fact that I was deeply deceived. And I said this on Easter, but as the hard times I've gone through as a Christian, and there's been some really hard times. They weren't easy, and I don't want to gloss over it and say, because the Holy Spirit was there, it was all A-okay, Right. There was a lot of hard times. But they pale in comparison to how lonely I felt as a child in a sort of atheist mindset. And it's really hard to explain the fact that when you're depressed, when you're in a dark place in that realm as an atheist, you have nowhere to go. Right. You have nothing to turn to. And deep down, I knew, I'm wired for something different, but I just don't know what it is. Right. And I think for Christians, there's two sides to it. One, we want to be an encouragement on one another. We want to challenge one another, like we were talking about. Iron sharpens iron. But we also want to stick out to the world around us, and we also want to live a life that can rise above and walk on the chaos of our times. And this is what we're all deeply after. And whether you pay attention to politics or whether you pay attention to the world, what's going on or not, we're all wanting that. We all want to tread on the chaos a little bit. And I will say this, and maybe this is the best way to wrap this up. In Ephesians, it says that we have everything in the spiritual realm that we need, basically.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
We have everything that we need.
The full armor of God.
Yes, we have the full armor of God, but in Ephesians 1, it's like, you have everything in the heavenly realms that you need. Jesus has provided it for you. And so when we look at the times we live in, and we hear things like World War III, or we hear things like financial collapse, or we hear things like whatever ideology that's freaking us out or stressing us out, we have to know that we were placed on the earth at this time for a reason. For whatever reason, Jesus believes that you and I and people that are listening are equipped for what we need in this next season. And as Christians, our job is not to say the next season's going to be great. Your best days are ahead. That's not our job. Our job is to say, even if you have some really rough times ahead, the kingdom of God is stronger than anything that the world has to throw at you. It's the only thing that we can, literally, it's the only thing we can hold on to. It's the raft that's been given to us. And the fact that God has equipped us for it, that he's going to take care of us, that in the moment of, let's say, war breaks out, or let's say something happens, the worst thing that you could think of, the Lord will supply what you need in that season to not only handle it, but to more than conquer it. Yeah. That is the promise of God.
And isn't that like the paradigm of the entire Bible? And even like the Revelation, we see on Facebook, like, we're in the end times. And it's like, all right, let's okay. But isn't that like the transcendent paradigm of like the Bible is like, no matter, because like people have had these exact conversations that we're having,
Yeah. Yep.
40, 50 years ago, not on a podcast, but
2,000 years ago.
Yeah. And
we've been in the latter days, we've been in the latter days since Jesus left. And it's true. There's this delineating point when Paul says we're in the latter days. We are in the latter days.
Right.
Now, what does the Bible say about that? It says, well, live like it's going to be tomorrow anyway.
That's the paradigm.
Always. That's the paradigm.
That's the paradigm.
So there's a part of you where you're like, all right, like, okay, you think it's the end times. Right. Then there's another part of you that's like, could be. I don't know. Yeah. My job is to live like it
always is.
Like it always is.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a I think that's encouraging and helpful.
Yes, I think so too. I don't know how anybody listening to this is going to feel with that. But I do think like our job as church leaders is to not give false hope. Our job is not to go, oh, hey, hold on. It's okay. It's going to be all okay and nothing bad will happen.
Right.
That would be us neglecting. Right. That would our job.
Right.
And our job is not to get people so whipped up and scared that they all move out into the middle of nowhere. And, there is an in-between. There's an in-between. And it's good to be prepared for the season that could be coming, mentally, physically, even, spiritually, even physically. Like, hey, get a little extra food or something. All that's a good idea. We don't need to be overcome with fear or anything like
anxieties.
that. No, it's not. That's not what it is. But we're innocent as doves, but wise as serpents. And we look at our times and we go, I don't trust you. Yeah. It doesn't seem like it's going in a good spot. I can control my reaction in my little sphere here, or I could vote for something. There's a little bit of control I exert. Ultimately, these are the times that we remember we're not in control. Right. Americans don't love to hear that. We're not in control. God is in control. And if it's going to slip sideways, it's not because he's forgetting us or forsaking us. Right. He's going to catch us in that in any season that we find ourselves in. But to wrap our hope into the systems of the world in this season, from my little opinion, it's a mistake. Don't wrap your trust and your hope and your reliance on the systems of the world. Wrap it into the kingdom and make that statement not a bumper sticker in your life. Make it something where you go, what does that mean? Now, for each one of us, it means something a little bit different, but it's built on a biblical foundation. It's built on a Holy Spirit foundation. It's built on a church that supports and challenges and everything else. If you've got those things, then you have what you need in this next season.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, so we're talking a lot about this idea of treading upon chaos, right? Like that's what we need to be doing. So practically what I'm hearing from you is read your Bible.
Yeah.
Pray, listen to the Holy Spirit, and then surround yourself with really good community.
It's always been that recipe, and in some ways we feel kind of snarky, read your Bible, and
we become stale to it, and we hear, kind of a strong word, but perverted versions of some of those things.
Sure, totally.
So,
right, yeah, and I think that's where, as church leaders, what I'm hoping for, and church leadership, our job has always been to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And we've been saying that a lot the last 2 years. And Living Streams, we're doing the best to walk that out. Our job is not to spoon feed you things so that you become more and more reliant on us to help you translate the Bible. Right. That is not our hope is that you come and you feel part of a community, that you feel like there is some leadership that's listening to the Holy Spirit, giving us some insight, some food for thought, some things to discuss as a community. And that is ultimately what our job is. And then to release people to do ministry, just like we are released to do ministry. Right. I have a job to do ministry on Sunday morning, and I speak to a bunch of people on Sunday. At the end of the day, though, I go home and I've got neighbors that come and hang out, and I've got some people that don't know Jesus in my life. Yeah. My sphere of actual influence is way smaller than the crowd on Sunday morning,
Absolutely.
So for everybody to understand that, hey, that's the safest place to be in this next season. Lord, what's the ministry you're calling me to? What are my neighbors' names? Maybe you don't know them. And you're like, okay, well, that's a small thing. I could go bring them cookies or something. There's so much grace in it. There's so much at easeness in it. Of okay, Lord, what have you put in my hands? Help me to steward it really well.
I mean, and maybe we can wrap it up after this, but I look at
I know we've been saying we're going to wrap up for 10 minutes.
But I look at our, community of believers and stuff, and some of the strong, not to negate the incredible staff that we have as vocational ministers on, staff at this church, but staff, I think a really good tell of the fruit of your discipleship at your church is if you can spot 3 to 4 people in your congregation that don't work at your church that seem to be the most biblically literate, I look at someone like Peter King, you know what I mean? Who's an amazing guy,
Yes.
you know, or, you know,
Daniel Riccio,
Daniel
and some of these guys
Riccio,
are like,
right,
you have
right.
more accolades than I do,
Yeah,
and more reason to do it, you know?
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
so key. That
Yeah.
is really important.
Right.
So, I mean, our hope really with the rest of the series, and we're going to be doing more of these sort of live podcast type things, but our hope for all of you that are watching, and thanks for watching this nice long podcast. But we're going to be doing this kind of a little bit more long form thought. And if you're nerdy like me, I talked about my nerdiness. This is good for us to kind of dive into and discuss. If you have any questions, we're going to be referring to some of these, and the address is ask@livingstreams.org. We set it up for you to ask questions, theology questions. It's not so much
Bible,
like Bible-based questions, that sort of thing. But if you have any questions you'd like for us to address in the next month or so, and if you stumbled onto this podcast from a year from now or something, then I don't know what we're going to be doing at that point.
I don't know
but the next week or so, email us, ask@livingstreams.org, or in the next month or so as we're going through this series. So thank you so much for joining us. If you got any thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear from you. So make sure and email us. Have a great day.